Charlie Kirk's funeral wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. A moment where thousands of voices shouted by loss merged into a single deafening roar for revival, for a return to a Christian America.
The evil murderer who took Charlie from us expected us to have a funeral today, and instead, my friends, we have had a revival in celebration of Charlie Kirk and of his Lord Jesus Christ.
The Apostle Paul describes how God establishes the rulers of the nations. In the audience right now, there are rulers of our land. And what does the Apostle Paul in Romans say about a godly leadership? He says that rulers wield the sword for the protection of good men and for the terror of evil men. May we pray that our rulers here, rightfully instituted and given power by our God, wield the sword for the terror of evil men in our nation in Charlie's memory.
You cannot defeat us, you cannot slow us, you cannot stop us, you cannot deter us. You have no idea the dragon you have awakened. You cannot frighten us, you cannot threaten us, because we are on the side of goodness, we are on the side of God.
You can feel it, can't you? That pull, that righteous desire to heal a broken nation, to fight back against the decay. Bringing moral Christian values to people is indeed a good thing, but only if it follows biblical principle, which excludes the involvement of the state. Christians are not to rule by the sword, but by conviction. There's a terrifying secret hidden behind Christian nationalism and its passion, a lesson written in the blood of millions. History screams a warning at us. The road to a Christian nation enforced by the state has been walked before, and it led the world straight into one of its darkest periods. The question we must ask is this: will Christians today repeat the same mistake that once plunged the world into the dark ages? The temptation is sure here. But to understand the crisis we face, we must first understand America's real origin story. Not the one just from a textbook, but the raw, desperate reality of why this nation was truly born. It began with an escape. Imagine living in a world where what you believe could get you arrested. A world where the church and the king told you exactly how to worship, what to pray, and when to pray it. If you disagreed, if your conscience led you to a different understanding of the Bible, you weren't just an outcast, you were a criminal. Your property could be seized, you could be in prison, tortured, or even burned at the stake for the crime of believing differently. This wasn't some dystopian fantasy. This was the brutal reality of millions of people in Europe for centuries. This was the world the pilgrims fled. When they boarded those small, creaking ships to cross a terrifying and vast ocean, they weren't just looking for a new land or economic opportunity. They were chasing an idea so radical it was revolutionary. Freedom of conscience. The God-given right to read the Bible for themselves and follow their convictions without a king or a pope forcing their hand. But the danger didn't stay in Europe. Even here in the New World, the old habits died hard. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, dissenters were whipped, banished, and even executed for daring to challenge the established church. A man named Roger Williams was driven out into the frozen wilderness simply for preaching that the government had no right to compel religious worship. It was he who went on to found Rhode Island, the first colony built entirely on the principle of absolute religious freedom. A century later, the men who gathered to form a new nation were students of the same history. They had seen the fire and they refused to get burned again. James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, put it bluntly. He witnessed firsthand how his home state of Virginia was jailing Baptist preachers for unlicensed preaching. He wrote that forcing a citizen to support a religion they don't believe in is nothing less than tyranny. To him, a person's duty to God was sacred and came before their duty to the state. The government had no right to get in the middle. Thomas Jefferson agreed. When a group of Baptists in Connecticut wrote to him, terrified that the government would meddle in their affairs, he wrote back with a promise. He promised them that the First Amendment had built a wall of separation between church and state. Now, let's be clear about that wall. It was not built to keep religion out of public life. George Washington, in a letter to a Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, gave them this powerful assurance. The United States, he said, gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance. For the first time in history, a head of state was promising not just to tolerate minorities, but to protect their right to worship as equal citizens. This was America's founding mission. They weren't rejecting God. They were creating a nation where faith could finally be real, authentic, and free. They understood a profound truth. Faith that is forced is not faith at all. It is coercion. And this is why when the Founding Fathers drafted the framework of the United States, they remembered all of this history well. They knew the terrible cost of church and state united. That is why in the very first line of the Bill of Rights, they enshrined this radical principle. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This was no accident. The First Amendment was designed to guard the conscience of every individual, whether Christian, Jew, or unbeliever, protecting citizens from the heavy hand of religious legislation. The founders believed that true faith could never be forced. It must be chosen freely, flowing from conviction, not compulsion. At its heart, America's mission was deeply Protestant: liberty of conscience, separation of church and state, Republican self-government grounded in the idea that all men are created equal, presented by their Creator with certain rights. These principles became the moral backbone of a new experiment in human freedom. They knew that when you give the state the sword to enforce religious doctrine, that sword will eventually be turned on anyone who disagrees. But their fear wasn't just based on theory or the struggles in the colonies. They were looking back at a specific 1,000-year-long chapter of human history where this toxic mixture plunged the world into darkness. To understand the fear that drove America's founders, we have to walk through the ashes of history. We have to go back to a time when faith wasn't a choice, but a command. When people hear the phrase the Dark Ages, they often think of castles, plagues, or knights. But history tells us something far more sobering. We are in Oxford, England. The year is 1555. Two scholars are about to be burned alive. Their crime? They refused to believe that the bread and wine of communion were the literal body and blood of Christ. They believed in the authority of the Bible over the traditions of the church. For this, the state acting on behalf of the church condemned them to the fire. As the flames licked at their feet, Latimer famously shouted to his friend, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." A candle of freedom, lit by the flames of persecution. This single horrific event was not an isolated incident. It was the standard operating procedure of an era history has called the Dark Ages. For centuries, starting in 538, the Roman Catholic Church held not just spiritual influence, but political power as well. It was a union of church and state. The Pope was not just a religious leader, his authority directed emperors and kings. Civil laws were passed to enforce church doctrine. If you disagreed with the official teaching, you weren't just a heretic, you were a criminal, an enemy of the state. This system created the Spanish Inquisition. People like William Tyndale hunted down for translating the Bible into English so common people could read it. Strangled and burned at the stake in 1536. His final prayer, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." Or the Waldenses, simple Christians hiding in the Alps, secretly teaching their children to memorize whole portions of Scripture. When discovered, they were massacred. Millions were imprisoned, tortured, or executed for the crime of thinking for themselves. They were punished for placing their conscience, guided by the Bible, above the decree of the church. It wasn't just a political issue, it was about control of conscience. The very book that promised liberty was kept from the people, while the institution claiming to represent it used force to demand absolute obedience. Obedience to the commandments of men. This is the history the American founders knew. It's the history they fled. They understood that when the church uses the power of the state to enforce its belief, the result is not righteousness, it is tyranny. This is why John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson in 1816 with these striking words, "I do not like the reappearance of the Jesuits. If ever there was a body of men who merited damnation on earth and in hell, it is this society of Loyolas." Adams, like many of the founders, understood both history and Bible prophecy. The founders knew that Martin Luther had rightfully sounded the alarm at the dawn of the Protestant Reformation, identifying the Antichrist power as none other than the papal system that united church and state to crush dissent. But here's where it gets even more important. History alone isn't enough, because Bible prophecy is more than a record of the past. It is history written in advance. And prophecy doesn't just confirm what has already happened, it tells us what is still to come. So let's open the book of Revelation. Let's see how the Bible actually talks about what we've covered thus far, and more importantly, let's discover what lies just ahead. To understand America's role and the danger we face today, we must turn to the final book of the Bible, Revelation, specifically to a prophecy in its 12th chapter. Revelation 12 paints a picture of a great cosmic war. It introduces us to a woman clothed with the sun, a symbol throughout the Bible of God's faithful church. She is pursued by a great red dragon, who the chapter itself identifies later as Satan. However, the prophecy shows the dragon trying to destroy the child born to the woman, which is a clear reference to Jesus Christ and Herod's attempt to kill him at birth. That points us to the fact that although Satan is the primary application to the dragon, in a secondary sense, that symbol represents the Roman power, particularly in its pagan state, which was the active agent of Satan at that time. The Bible continues and tells us that the child is caught up unto God and to his throne. After Christ's ascension, the dragon turns his full fury on the woman, the church. The prophecy says that the woman was forced to flee into the wilderness, where she would be nourished for a time and times and half a time. Now, for those who have studied prophecy, the time period is crucial. In the Bible's prophetic clock, a day equals a literal year. The period of 1260 days is the same time frame as the Dark Ages we just discussed. The 1260 years from 538 AD to 1798 AD, when the church united with the state reigned supreme in Europe. The wilderness wasn't a literal desert. It was a condition of obscurity, of hiding. For centuries, the true faith was kept alive not in the grand cathedrals, but in the secluded valleys of the Alps by people like the Waldenses, in the secret gatherings of the Albigenses, and in the hearts of reformers who dared to choose the Bible over tradition. They were the woman in the wilderness. But the prophecy doesn't stop there. The dragon was not satisfied. He was enraged that this flame of truth refused to be extinguished, and so he unleashes a final desperate attack. This is where the story turns toward us, toward America. Verse 15 says, "And the serpent cast out of his mouth water as a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away of the flood." Think about this imagery. A flood isn't a single soldier. A flood is an overwhelming, all-encompassing force. This flood was the full might of the old world powers. It was armies, inquisitions, crusades, and a wave after wave of persecution designed to utterly sweep away the fleeing church. It was the Bartholomew Days massacre in France, the Spanish Armada sent to crush Protestant England, the 30 Years' War that drenched Europe in blood. It was an attempt of total annihilation. The woman, God's persecuted people, was at a breaking point. Trapped, the powers of Europe, the established world, were closing in. It seemed there was nowhere left to run. And then, God did something unexpected. The prophecy reveals the next move. Verse 16, read this carefully. And the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened her mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon cast out of his mouth. The earth helped the woman. What does this mean? Those studying these verses can see something extraordinary. In Bible prophecy, waters and seas often represent peoples, multitudes, and nations, as we can see, for example, in Revelation 17:15. This is in reference to the densely populated areas of the world, like Europe. We see this confirmation even in the Old Testament, where Daniel chapter 7 describes 4 beasts representing kingdoms rising from the sea. But here, a new symbol is introduced. Not the sea, but the earth. If the sea is the crowded old world, then the earth must symbolize the opposite, a new, vast, sparsely populated land, a place of refuge, a new world. At the very moment the flood of persecution was at its peak in Europe, God opened a new continent. The discovery of the Americas was not an accident of history. It was an act of divine providence. This new world became the escape route. It opened her mouth and provided a sanctuary. The millions of people fleeing persecution, the Huguenots from France, the Puritans from England, the Moravians from Germany, were swallowed up by the vast open shores of America. The Atlantic Ocean, which seemed like a barrier, became their passage to safety. The wilderness that seemed so intimidating became their shield. Here, in this new land, the old hierarchies and oppressive structures of Europe could not reach them. The flood of persecution was stopped dead in its tracks at the coastline of a new world. This wasn't just immigration, it was the fulfillment of prophecy. America was raised up by God for a specific purpose, to be a haven for the oppressed, a place where the principles of freedom of conscience could finally take root. And the form of government that arose here was unlike anything the world has ever seen. This brings us to the very next chapter, Revelation 13, which builds upon what we've seen this far and again describes the rise of the United States under the symbol of a beast. But unlike the beast from the sea, this one comes up out of the earth. Why? Because that is what Revelation 12 had already explained. And the prophecy gives us its defining characteristic. It had 2 lamb-like horns, not the claws of a leopard or the terrifying horns of a dragon, but horns like a lamb, gentle, youthful, non-aggressive, Christ-like. What are these 2 lamb-like horns? They're the 2 founding principles that made America unique in all of human history: republicanism and Protestantism. Think about it. Republicanism is a government without a king. Protestantism is supposed to be a church without a pope. Together, these 2 horns represented the ultimate separation of church and state. They established for the first time a nation where civil and religious liberty were the law of the land. A nation where you could worship or not worship according to the dictates of your own conscience without fear of the government breaking down your door. This was the secret of America's power and prosperity. It was a fulfillment of a divine plan to give humanity one last sanctuary of freedom before the end of time. A lamb-like nation, a light to the world. But the prophecy does not end there. It contains a chilling warning, a pivot that speaks directly to the calls for Christian unity and political power we are starting to hear today. The prophecy about this lamb-like beast born from the earth to be a beacon of freedom ends with this terrifying phrase, "And he spake as a dragon." This isn't just a change in tone, it's a terrifying transformation of character. In the prophetic language of Revelation 12, the dragon is the original persecutor, the power that haunted the woman, God's people, through the wilderness and made war against them. To speak as a dragon, therefore, is to adopt its methods: force, coercion, and the use of civil power to enforce religious decrees. It is the voice that demands unity through compliance and punishes dissent. It's the voice that says, "You will believe as we believe and worship as we command, or you will face consequences." This stands as a complete and tragic betrayal of America's lamb-like origins. A lamb, the symbol of Christ, who persuades through love, sacrifice, and truth. Its kingdom is not of this world, and it never forces belief at the point of a sword or through the threat of a law. The United States was established as a radical experiment to permanently silence the dragon's voice in the halls of government. The founders, having witnessed centuries of state-sponsored religious bloodshed in Europe, built a wall of separation between church and state specifically to ensure that government would remain lamb-like, protecting freedom for all rather than becoming a dragon that enforces the faith of a majority. For America to speak as a dragon means its laws would begin to echo the intolerant decrees of the old world system our forefathers fled. It means the government would morph from a neutral protector of conscience into an enforcer of doctrine. The prophecy warns that this nation, born as a sanctuary, would one day repudiate its own founding principles, shattering the bedrock of liberty and becoming the very image of oppressive power it was created to escape. Are we hearing the first whispers of that dragon's voice today?
You have no idea the dragon you have awakened.
When we listen to the cries for America to be declared a Christian nation by law, when we hear sincere but zealous voices demanding that the government enforce religious values, when our grief and our desire for a better world tempts us to use political power to compel righteousness, we must pause. We have to ask ourselves, have we forgotten our own story? We saw a church with the power of the state create 1,000 years of darkness. We saw a nation born to be a refuge from that very power, a lamb-like nation foretold in prophecy that would offer the world a new beginning of freedom. And we heard the same prophecies warning that this nation of freedom would one day speak with the voice of a dragon. Are we about to get there right now? The temptation is sure here. The founders gave us the First Amendment for a reason. They knew that freedom of conscience is fragile, and the moment the government takes sides in religion, everyone's liberty is at risk. Our biblical call is to reflect the character of a lamb, not the voice of a dragon. The gospel power is in persuasion, not political force. It is love that sets people free. It does not put them in chains. And so the choice is ours, to stand for freedom of conscience for everyone, even for those with whom we disagree, to be a people known for our love, not our legislation, to refuse to repeat the very mistakes that plunged the world into the dark ages. The Bible tells us that God's last day people will be defined not by their political influence, but by their faithful characters. They are described with these simple, powerful words. Here's the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. Let's be lamb-like Christians and say no to the temptation to unite church and state.